The fate of entire civilizations was decided in a single day. Two armies, two worlds, two great commanders clashed on the endless plain. On one side was the young and daring conqueror Alexander. On the other was the powerful King Darius III, ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. This was not just a battle, but the culmination of a grand campaign, a clash of two different philosophies of war: strength versus discipline, numbers versus tactics, tradition versus innovation. Here, under the scorching sun of Mesopotamia, it was decided who would rule the ancient East for hundreds of years to come. The outcome of this battle changed the map of the world and ushered in a new era in human history. This is the story of how one ingenious plan, executed with iron will, was able to crush an army that seemed invincible. Watch the video to the end to find out how Alexander the Great used one risky maneuver to turn the huge Persian army into a chaotic mob. What if I told you that the outcome of the greatest battle of antiquity was predetermined even before it began? It all came down to the personalities of two commanders whose worlds and outlooks on life were completely opposite. Alexander was a man of action, fire, and an insatiable thirst for glory. He grew up on stories of heroes and gods, considering himself a descendant of Achilles. His whole life was a campaign, a continuous forward movement, where each victory was only a step towards the next. For him, retreat or compromise were unthinkable, and risk was his natural habitat. Darius III, on the contrary, was a guardian ruler, a symbol of stability and the immutability of a vast empire. He inherited a throne that united dozens of peoples, and his main task was to preserve this legacy. He thought in terms of territories, resources, and traditions, not rapid conquests. When Alexander invaded his domain, Darius initially perceived it as another border disturbance. He could not understand the mentality of a man who was willing to risk everything for an idea, for glory. The king of Persia relied on the power of his empire, its inexhaustible resources and centuries-old foundations. Alexander, on the other hand, relied on the faith of his soldiers and his own genius. His army was not just a military force, but a brotherhood that had gone through fire and water. They trusted their leader unconditionally because he was always at the forefront, in the thick of battle. Darius commanded his army from the center, protected by thousands of elite warriors. His role was that of a strategist, observing the chessboard from a safe distance. This fundamental contrast in approach to leadership would play a decisive role in the coming battle. Alexander sought a decisive battle to crush the empire with a single blow. Darius, despite his numerical superiority, was forced to accept this challenge, defending the heart of his country. At the field of Gaugamela, it was not just armies that met, but two different universes. One was dynamic, compact, and united by a single will. The other was huge, multifaceted, but inert, like the empire it represented. The fate of the world depended on whose philosophy would prove stronger at the decisive moment. Their confrontation was not just a conflict between two powers, but a clash between the old order and a new, unstoppable force. A force that came to change the world forever. What do you think is more important for victory? Countless resources or the strength of spirit and genius of one person? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next episodes. I see you've switched to a completely different topic, from architecture and survival in the cold to ancient battles, specifically the Battle of Gaugamela between Alexander the Great and Darius III. This is interesting historical material on military strategy and psychology. Want to know the secret that King Darius III considered his main strategic trump card, but which paradoxically ended up being one of the reasons for his crushing defeat? That critical secret was the battlefield itself. A vast plain near the small village of Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq, 331 BC. The Persian king did not choose this particular location by chance or on a whim. He methodically prepared it as a theatrical stage for his grand triumph over the insolent Macedonian youth. The location was a weapon that Darius intended to use in the same way a soldier uses a sword. The choice of field was part of his strategy, not just a backdrop for the drama. It was a perfectly flat, wide valley, completely devoid of hills, ravines, or any natural obstacles to maneuvering. On Darius's direct orders, thousands of engineers carefully leveled the ground, removing stones, bushes, and unevenness over an area of several kilometers. The goal was crystal clear: to create ideal conditions for his main striking forces, chariots and cavalry. The plain was not found, but created by man. A man-made arena for mass murder, where every stone was removed so as not to prevent the chariot wheels from accelerating to maximum speed. Darius relied primarily on his fearsome war chariots with sharp sickles on their wheels and his numerous cavalry, tens of thousands of horsemen. In open space without obstacles, these mobile units could develop maximum lethal speed and widely cover the flanks of a compact enemy on both sides. The Persian king deliberately wanted to deprive the dense Macedonian phalanx of its traditional advantages in maneuvering on hilly terrain, where it could use the relief to protect its flanks. Darius removed everything that could help Alexander. No cover, no obstacles, only bare ground where numbers would crush skill. He intended to coolly use his overwhelming numerical superiority of 3 to 5 times to surround and methodically destroy Alexander's relatively compact army of 47,000. The plain was his giant chessboard, on which he placed his numerous pieces along the edges, absolutely confident of inevitable victory. He effectively gave Alexander a tough choice: either accept battle on his unfavorable terms or retreat in disgrace without a fight, admitting defeat. There was no third option. Darius controlled the space and dictated the rules of the game. Alexander, having personally conducted a thorough reconnaissance of the area, understood Darius's cunning plan perfectly. His experienced generals, in particular the old and cautious Parmenion, wisely advised him to attack suddenly at night, in order to neutralize the Persians' numerical superiority in the chaos of darkness. But the young Alexander categorically rejected this tactic, proudly declaring that he would not steal victory like a thief, but would take it openly during the day. Pride or strategy? Perhaps both. Alexander understood that a night attack could sow panic in his own ranks, where discipline was more important than numbers. Instead of cunning, he accepted the direct challenge and calmly ordered his troops, exhausted from the march, to set up camp and rest well before the decisive battle. The Macedonians slept well and ate well before the battle, restoring their strength. This seemingly simple move gave them a huge critical psychological and physical advantage of freshness and vigor. A rested soldier is worth 2 tired ones. All commanders knew this, but not all could afford the luxury of sleep before battle. The huge Persian army, fearing a sudden night attack by the Macedonians, stood in full battle formation under arms all night long. Tens of thousands of soldiers did not sleep a wink, straining their eyes into the darkness, expecting an attack at any moment. By morning, when the sun rose, they were completely exhausted, both mentally and physically. Their legs ached, their eyes were heavy, and their concentration was zero. Fear proved to be a worse enemy than the real enemy. The Persians fought shadows all night, wasting their strength on nothing. Thus, the brilliant Alexander began the battle even before the first physical clash of spears. He psychologically allowed the enemy to exhaust themselves with anticipation and fear, without spending a single arrow. Darius's excessive confidence in his chosen field paradoxically turned against him. He waited for an attack that never came, exhausting his troops in vain. Darius was so confident in his plan that he could not believe that Alexander was simply sleeping. He created ideal conditions for his massive army of chariots and cavalry, but these same conditions proved ideal for the implementation of the young Alexander's bold, unconventional plan. The Persian king did not take into account one critical factor. On perfectly flat terrain, not only is the perfect order of the formation clearly visible, but so is the nascent chaos and panic in the ranks. Transparency worked both ways. Darius could see Alexander, but Alexander could also see every movement of the Persians, anticipating their actions. Darius created the perfect field for his army. But what if the ideal conditions for one side could unexpectedly become a deadly trap? In the next chapter, we will see how Alexander planned to cunningly turn the Persians' main strength, their numbers, into their fatal weakness through maneuvering. I will reveal the most closely guarded military secret of that era. What the armies that clashed in the decisive battle for supremacy over Asia at Gaugamela actually looked like, and how they functioned. It was not so much a matter of the absolute number of soldiers on the field as their combat quality, training, and philosophy of warfare. Alexander the Great's army was a living organism, a well-oiled machine, hardened by years of continuous grueling campaigns and victories from Greece to India. It was a weapon honed to perfection by war. Every cog knew its place. Every detail worked in sync with the others without a hitch. It was a professional standing army, where every soldier was an experienced master of his craft, having dedicated his life to war. The backbone of the Macedonian army was the legendary Macedonian phalanx, an indestructible moving wall of thousands of long sarissa spears up to 6 meters long. The phalanx soldiers acted as a single entity with a single will, their coordinated movements honed to perfection through endless training and real combat. The phalanx was not a group of people, but a single organism. One brain controlled thousands of arms and legs, moving in sync like in a dance of death, where one mistake killed them all. But the real surgical scalpel in Alexander's skilled hands was his elite heavy cavalry, the hetairoi, the king's comrades. These were heavily armed horsemen in armor with long spears, personally loyal to their young king until death, ready to die for him. It was these mounted strike forces that delivered the decisive deadly blows, breaking through the enemy's formation at its weakest and most vulnerable point like a knife through butter. The hetairoi were the hammer, the phalanx the anvil. Between them, the enemy was crushed into a bloody mass with no chance of escape. Each Macedonian warrior knew exactly what his specific task was in battle, and blindly trusted the commander standing next to him in formation. Their strength lay in their iron unity of spirit, strict discipline, and rich combat experience of victories. They had traveled thousands of kilometers together through deserts and mountains and won dozens of bloody battles against various enemies, which made them absolutely confident in themselves and their brilliant leader, Alexander. Victory was a habit, not a hope. They did not know what defeat was, so they did not fear it, and fear is a soldier's main enemy on the battlefield. The army of the Persian king Darius III, on the other hand, was a huge, diverse conglomerate of tribes and peoples of the empire. It was a typical imperial army, forcibly assembled from all corners of the vast empire, from Egypt to India. Under his royal banners stood Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Sogdians, Indians, Arabs, and even Greek professional mercenaries who had sold their spears for gold. It was not an army, but a collection of armies speaking dozens of languages and praying to different gods. Its strength lay in its formidable numbers, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and the exotic diversity of its troops. At the center stood the king's personal guard, the legendary Immortals, 10,000 of the empire's best warriors in golden armor. On the flanks were numerous heterogeneous cavalry from different nations, and at the front of the formation were fearsome war elephants from India and sickle-shaped chariots with sharp blades on their wheels. The diversity was intended to demoralize the enemy at a glance. How could they fight something they had never seen before? However, this impressive diversity was paradoxical, and its main critical weakness for coordination. The warriors spoke dozens of different languages without interpreters, used completely different battle tactics, and obeyed their own local leaders and satraps, rather than the king directly. They lacked the organic cohesion and intuitive understanding on the battlefield that the monolithic Macedonians had. The Persian army was a crowd, not an organism. Many heads, but no single brain giving orders to all at once. Many of the Persian warriors were not professional veteran soldiers at all, but mobilized militiamen and peasants loyal to their local satraps and tribal chiefs, rather than to the distant king himself. Their combat motivation and morale were far inferior to Alexander's battle-hardened veterans, who had seen death 1,000 times. They were numerically strong as long as they maintained a tight formation and felt the overwhelming numerical superiority around them, which gave them confidence. But as soon as the formation faltered, their confidence evaporated instantly, turning into panic. A crowd is only strong in its belief in its own strength, and doubt kills it faster than a sword. Thus, two diametrically opposed military concepts and philosophies clashed on the dusty field of Gaugamela. On the one hand, there was the quality of training, professionalism, and unity. On the other, there was the quantity of bodies, diversity, and mass. On the one hand, a monolithic, well-oiled war machine. On the other, a grandiose but loose and chaotic coalition of peoples. Hammer against anvil, scalpel against club, a clash of principles, not just of people. Alexander deliberately sought to counter the heavy power of the Persians with his lightning-fast maneuvers, surgical precision of attack, and perfect coordination of all parts of the army as one body. He knew perfectly well from experience that if this huge, cumbersome mechanism was deprived of centralized control by decapitation, it would crumble and fall apart on its own due to internal contradictions. Kill the head, and the body will die. An ancient principle of hunting large game, applied to an army of hundreds of thousands. But how could such a diverse army as the Persians effectively coordinate their complex actions in the chaos of real battle without radios or telephones? This was the key question, and Alexander knew the answer and intended to use it.
They expect us to hold the line.
What I am about to show you broke all the rules of warfare at that time. Alexander understood that a head-on attack on the superior forces of the Persians was a sure path to defeat. Therefore, he developed an asymmetrical and daring plan that was intended to mislead the enemy. His army was not lined up parallel to the Persian front, but at an angle. The right flank, which he personally commanded, was pushed far forward, while the left flank, under the command of Parmenion, was pulled back. This formation is known as a skewed formation, or diagonal attack. The purpose of this maneuver was not to crush the entire Persian army. The goal was to get to Darius. Alexander believed that the Persian army was held together solely by the figure of the king, and that if he were eliminated, the whole system would collapse. The plan was to force the Persians to stretch their front. Moving to the right along the Persian line, Alexander provoked the enemy's left flank cavalry to follow him. This movement was bound to create a gap between the Persian flank and the center. It was into this gap that Alexander planned to strike with a lightning wedge of his cavalry, the hetairoi. It was a risky gambit. It weakened his own center and left his left flank vulnerable. But Alexander was willing to take that risk. To protect himself from encirclement, he created a second line from reserve infantry units. These troops were ready to turn around and repel any attempt by the Persians to strike from the rear. It was a kind of insurance for his daring attack. A separate plan was developed to neutralize the scythed chariots. The light infantry was ordered not to stand still, but to step aside when the chariots approached, creating corridors. Breaking through these traps, the chariots would become easy targets for the warriors standing on the sides. It was a complex, multi-layered plan that required each unit to have perfect discipline and understanding of its role. It was based on psychology and precise calculation, not brute force. Alexander turned the battle into a complex geometric problem. He had no intention of playing by Darius's rules. Instead of allowing the Persians to exploit their numerical superiority, he imposed his own game on them, a game in which the speed and accuracy of a single strike decided everything. But how could even the most ingenious plan work against an army several times larger than your own? In the next chapter, we will see how this battle began. With the first rays of the sun, the Macedonian army began to move. In complete silence, without battle cries, the phalanx began its slow but inexorable march forward. The calm and confident stride of this huge fighting machine made a strong impression on the Persians, who were exhausted from their night vigil. Alexander, as planned, led his right flank not directly at the enemy, but to the right, along the Persian line. This diagonal maneuver immediately stumped the Persian commanders. They did not understand whether he was trying to outflank them or retreat. This move was designed to take the battle beyond the prepared, level ground of the Persians. Alexander led his troops onto more uneven terrain, where the advantage of chariots and heavy cavalry was reduced. Darius watched this strange maneuver from the center of his army. Seeing that the Macedonians were moving further and further to the right, he gave the order to his left flank cavalry under the command of the satrap Bessus. The horsemen were to attack and stop this movement to prevent Alexander from bypassing his entire army. Thousands of Bactrian and Scythian horsemen rushed towards the hetairoi. This was exactly what Alexander had been waiting for. The Persian cavalry, rushing after his troops, began to break away from their center. The Persian front line began to stretch like a taut bowstring, and dangerous gaps began to appear in it. The first skirmishes began on the far right flank. Light cavalry on both sides entered the fray, trying to gauge each other's strength and intentions. The air was filled with the roar of tens of thousands of men and horses. Alexander personally led his hetairoi, constantly assessing the changing situation. He did not rush to bring his main forces into battle, waiting for the perfect moment. His task was to draw as many enemy forces as possible towards him. Meanwhile, the Macedonian phalanx in the center and on the left flank continued to move forward slowly, maintaining perfect formation. They were the axis around which their king's risky maneuver unfolded. Their steadfastness and discipline were the key to the success of the entire plan. The tension grew with every passing minute. Provoked by Alexander's maneuver, the Persian army began to lose its original formation. The huge army was slowly being drawn into a game whose rules were dictated by the young Macedonian king. Are you ready for the shocking truth about the Persian army's most formidable weapon? Seeing his left flank drawn into battle, Darius decided it was time to play his trump card. He gave the order, and hundreds of scythed chariots rushed toward the center of the Macedonian phalanx. It was a terrifying sight, designed to sow panic and break the infantry formation. Heavy chariots, with razor-sharp blades on their axles, rushed toward the indestructible wall of sarissas. Any army of that time would have faltered at the sight of such an attack. But Alexander had a ready answer. When the chariots approached, something unexpected happened. The soldiers in the front line of the phalanx stepped aside on command, forming narrow corridors in their ranks. It was a brilliant mousetrap tactic. The chariots, unable to maneuver, flew into these passages at full speed. They rushed through the formation, causing virtually no damage. The same chariots that tried to turn were met with a forest of spears. The horses, frightened by the sarissa pikes, reared up or bolted to the sides. Control was lost, and the formidable weapon turned into a disorderly mass. The light infantry standing behind the main lines finished the job. They attacked the broken chariots from the sides and rear, striking the drivers and cutting the harnesses. The entire attack, on which Darius had pinned such high hopes, faltered in a matter of minutes. The failure of this attack had enormous psychological significance. The Persian warriors who watched it saw how their miracle weapon was neutralized with astonishing ease. Their confidence in victory began to melt away. The discipline and training of the Macedonian soldiers proved stronger than the most formidable weapons of the Persians. They did not flinch or panic, but calmly carried out their commander's orders. The phalanx wall remained intact. Alexander, watching from the flank, was convinced that his calculations were correct. His army was ready for any challenge. Now he could focus entirely on his main goal. Darius's trump card had been beaten. What would the Persian king do next? In the next chapter, we will see the decisive moment of the entire battle. While the drama with the chariots was unfolding in the center, the cavalry battle continued on the right flank. Carried away by the pursuit of the hetairoi, Bessus's Persian cavalry broke away from the infantry in the center. Alexander saw what he had been waiting for all this time. A noticeable gap had formed in the Persian front. This was his chance, and there might not be another. He instantly gave the order, and his squadrons of hetairoi, which had been moving to the right, turned sharply. They regrouped into a powerful striking wedge, the tip of which was directed straight at the gap that had formed. At the head of this attack, as always, was Alexander himself. He led his best cavalry in a desperate breakthrough. The target was not the infantry or the cavalry. The target was Darius himself, who was in the center of his army behind the infantry line. It was a blow of incredible force and speed. The heavy Macedonian horsemen charged at full speed into the weakened center of the Persian army. The Persian infantry lines, which did not expect such a blow, were simply swept away. The formation, which had seemed so solid, began to crumble. The wedge of the Getae, without slowing down, pushed deeper and deeper, sowing confusion in its path. The ordinary Persian infantrymen were not prepared to withstand such an onslaught from the elite cavalry. Several phalanx regiments, which Alexander had prudently kept in reserve, rushed into the breach behind the Hetairoi. They widened the gap, preventing the Persians from closing ranks and cutting off the cavalry. The Macedonian war machine worked as a single, well-coordinated mechanism. Chaos in the center of the Persian army grew. Commanders lost control of their troops. Soldiers who saw the enemy break through to the very heart of their formation began to waver. Alexander and his horsemen, ignoring the resistance on either side, stubbornly advanced toward a single point on the battlefield. They moved toward the place where the great king's magnificent chariot towered above the ranks of soldiers. The battle was entering its decisive phase. The wedge of the Getae was so swift that Darius's personal guard barely had time to react. Alexander and his best warriors broke through to the immediate vicinity of the Persian king. From his high chariot, Darius could see the furious face of the young conqueror. A desperate battle ensued around the royal chariot. The immortals and Greek mercenaries desperately tried to hold back the Macedonian onslaught. But the Hetairoi, inspired by the presence of their king, fought with incredible energy. At one point, Darius's charioteer was knocked out of action. Left without control, the horses became frightened and began to bolt. For a moment, it seemed that the king himself was in danger. Darius, watching his best guard collapse and Alexander inevitably approaching, made a fateful decision. He was not a warrior by nature, unlike his opponent. He was a ruler, and the thought of captivity was more frightening to him than any outcome of the battle. Overcome with fear, Darius turned his chariot around and fled. He abandoned his army, his banner, and his honor to save his own life. This moment became a turning point, not only in the battle, but in the entire war. The king's flight did not go unnoticed. The soldiers of the Persian center, seeing that their leader had left the battlefield, lost all will to resist. If the king was fleeing, what was there for them to fight for? Panic, like a forest fire, began to spread through the huge army. What had been an organized army was turning into an uncontrollable mob before their very eyes. The order to fight lost all meaning. The center of the Persian army completely collapsed. Soldiers threw down their weapons and tried to escape. Alexander had achieved his goal. By decapitating the army, he had destroyed it as a fighting force. After Darius's flight, the battle turned into a rout in one part of the field and a desperate defense in another. The Persian center and left flank turned into a panicked retreat, pursued by Macedonian cavalry and light infantry. The huge army simply dissolved, turning into crowds of fleeing people. However, while Alexander was making his triumphant breakthrough, his left flank found itself in a dire situation. The experienced Macedonian general Parmenion held back the onslaught of the Persian right cavalry under the command of the satrap Mazaios. The Persians had numerical superiority here and attacked with great tenacity. Moreover, part of the Persian and Indian cavalry managed to break through the Macedonian infantry line. They rushed not to the rear of the phalanx, but to the Macedonian camp, hoping to free the prisoners and capture the baggage train. Parmenion was in danger of being surrounded. He sent messengers to Alexander with a desperate plea for help. At that moment, Alexander was faced with the most important choice of his life. Right in front of him was Darius running away. If he captured him, he could end the war in a single day. But behind him, his soldiers and his best friend and comrade in arms, Parmenion, were dying. The duty of a commander outweighed the thirst for personal glory. With a heavy heart, Alexander gave up the pursuit of Darius. He gathered his weary Hetairoi and deployed them to strike the rear of the Persian cavalry attacking Parmenion. This maneuver demonstrated his greatness not only as a tactician, but also as a leader responsible for the lives of his men. He sacrificed the crown of victory to save his army. The appearance of Alexander and his elite cavalry behind the attacking Persians decided the outcome of the battle on this flank as well. Mazai's horsemen, trapped on both sides and learning of their king's flight, also faltered and turned to flee. Now the entire Persian army was defeated. The victory was complete and unconditional. Alexander proved once again that discipline, tactics, and brilliant leadership mean more than simple numerical superiority. The battlefield remained behind him. When the thick dust of battle finally settled, The exhausted but jubilant Macedonians were presented with a picture of complete and utter triumph. The huge Persian army of hundreds of thousands had ceased to exist as a fighting force. It had been destroyed, scattered, or fled in panic. The blood-stained field was littered with abandoned chariots, weapons, armor, and luxurious tents filled with untold riches from the royal treasury: gold, silver, and precious stones. The battlefield turned into a giant warehouse of abandoned property that no one could defend. The wealth of the empire lay at the feet of the victors, awaiting new owners. Alexander personally seized the personal baggage train of the fleeing Darius, his royal chariot decorated with gold, his bow and shield, symbols of royal power over Asia. The entire family of the Persian king fell into the hands of the victors, including his elderly mother Sisygambis, his beautiful wife Statira, and his young children, precious hostages. Alexander treated them with demonstrative royal generosity and respect, which made a huge propaganda impression on all the conquered peoples of the empire. He was not a barbarian robber, but the legitimate successor to the king, behaving royally even towards the enemy's family. The victory at Gaugamela on October 1st, 331 BC, was of decisive historical importance for the whole world. It was not just another tactically won battle in a long chain of victories. It was the end of the powerful Achaemenid Persian Empire, which had existed for more than 2 centuries and stretched from Egypt to India. One day changed the map of the world. An empire that seemed eternal collapsed in a few hours of battle, proving that nothing is eternal, even what seems unshakable. After this catastrophic defeat, King Darius III lost all political authority and legitimacy, and was soon treacherously betrayed and killed by his own satraps Bessus during his flight. Alexander became the undisputed ruler of all Asia by right of conquest and inheritance. The gates of Babylon with its hanging gardens, Susa with its treasuries, and Persepolis, the greatest and richest cities of the ancient world, which had accumulated centuries of wealth, opened before him without a fight. The world lay at his feet, awaiting a new master. The young man from Macedonia became the ruler of Asia, something even the Persian kings of the past had not dared to dream of. A new era in human history began, which historians would later call the Hellenistic era of cultural synthesis. Greek culture, the Koine language, and philosophy began to spread widely and penetrate vast territories from Egypt in the west to India in the east. The world as it had been known before, with clear boundaries between east and west, changed forever. Borders were erased, mixing began, giving birth to a new civilization on the ruins of the old. Alexander was not just a conqueror and destroyer, but a builder of a new world, uniting different elements into a single whole. Victory was achieved thanks to Alexander's ingenious and daring plan, based on a deep understanding of the enemy's psychology and weaknesses. Alexander masterfully exploited Darius's apparent strengths, numerical superiority, and a prepared level field, and paradoxically turned them against him as a weapon. He forced the huge, unwieldy army to stretch out into a thin line, deliberately created a critical weak spot in it with a gap, and delivered a single precise, surgically calibrated deadly blow with a spear to the heart, right to the center, where Darius himself stood. The victory was not accidental, but the result of calculation. Every move was planned, every reaction of the enemy anticipated. The Battle of Gaugamela has forever entered the textbooks of military art and academies around the world. It has become a classic textbook example of how a smaller but significantly better organized, trained, and managed force can win a convincing victory over a numerical giant. It was a triumph of tactics, strategy, and intellect over brute force. Brains defeated brawn, proving that war is an art, not just violence. Quality defeated quantity, a lesson that armies still teach today, thousands of years later. Alexander the Great convincingly proved to the world that the fate of entire empires is decided not by the number of soldiers on the battlefield, but by the iron will and sharp mind of one man, the commander. His victory was not simply a military conquest of territory, but the beginning of a grand new global project to merge the cultures of the West and the East into a single civilization. The consequences of that fateful day on October 1st, 331 BC, are still felt in world history, culture, and politics today. 2 millennia later, the cities founded by Alexander still stand. Greek words have entered all languages. And his empire, although it fell apart, laid the foundations for the modern world, where East and West are inextricably linked. The Battle of Gaugamela is not just a story about the clash of two armies. It is an epic drama about how the genius, discipline, and unyielding will of one man can change the course of history. Alexander the Great did not just win. He imposed his game on his opponent and won it by his own rules. He turned Darius's strengths, his numerical superiority, and the perfectly flat terrain into his main weaknesses. This victory marked the end of one great civilization and the birth of a new, Hellenistic one, which synthesized the best of Europe and Asia. We have told you about Alexander's ingenious tactics. What other great battles or commanders would you like to learn about in the next videos? Suggest your topics in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.